The fire was gluttonous that night. She watched from the window of her apartment building as it devoured the small 2-story home just a few blocks away. It ate away at the roof and gable that licked the insides clean with glowing orange tongues. It roared with laughter as it gorged itself, then belched black smoke into the sky. Sirens wailed through the air, the desperate cries of emergency vehicles that would never make it to the scene. Not until the glutton had its fill, when all that remained would be the home's charred black skeleton and the twisted, scorched bodies of the family who once lived there. Only then, when there was nothing left to save, would the barricades be removed and the fire engines and ambulances be allowed passage. On the street below, she could hear cheering. In the distance, gunshots. Another night devolved into chaos. By morning, the streets would be quiet and the house would be nothing but a pile of smoldering ashes. But tonight, carnage would reign. Such was life in the autonomous zone. It hadn't always been that way. There was a time not long ago when lynch mobs didn't rule the night and people weren't always looking over their shoulder. But that had changed with one anonymous post on an internet message board. They pretend to be us, but they are not us. Beware the imitators. When it first popped up, most considered it to be nonsense, a meme people reposted on social media when it didn't have anything important to say. But within a week, it was reblogged around the internet millions of times. The word imitators trickled its way into office water cooler talk and conversations around the family dinner table. It wasn't long before people began to profit off of it. Entrepreneurs looking to make a quick buck started printing up t-shirts and coffee mugs with "Beware the Imitators" written on them. As it rose in popularity, some began taking it more serious, even asking questions in an effort to decode the cryptic message. Who are the imitators? What do they want? Online communities gathered on forums where users argued over every nuance of the post's words. Podcasts were next, as conspiracy theorists spread their thoughts on the subject to millions of curious listeners. 2 months after the strange warning was originally posted, a shocking survey was published by a national research institute, stating that 12% of the US population believed that the imitators were a real threat to the country, even if no one could agree on what it was they even were. Major media outlets were quick to capitalize on hysteria, and within days, talking heads were alluding to it on TV. Soon the news was reporting on physical altercations between paranoid people accusing each other of being imitators, and by summer, politicians were referencing the post directly at their rallies. A second study published in the fall confirmed that the numbers of true believers had more than tripled. Tensions boiled over. Things got out of hand when a man in Columbus strangled his wife and daughter because he thought they had been replaced with imitators. Shortly after, a disturbed young man wearing body armor and carrying an AR-15 was arrested for opening fire in a crowded shopping center. He gunned down 15 people before being apprehended. When his manifesto was recovered by police, it was revealed that he believed the mall was being used as an imitator breeding ground. Protests erupted across the U.S. Confrontations with the police became violent and deadly, and soon, people were rioting. The ensuing chaos allowed bad actors a chance to move in, set up shop in urban neighborhoods where they secured strongholds, and once that happened, things got even uglier. She wondered how many people were killed during tonight's madness as she looked on through the window. Perhaps it wasn't worth thinking about. Her focus softened to her own reflection, and she let out a sigh of disgust. What an old crone, she thought. She had the face of a hag, thin gray hair and eyes like ice. Her skin sagged off of her neck like a turkey's waddle, and from the side her long, gaunt frame and rounded shoulders were reminiscent of a shepherd's crook. She hid her form beneath a baggy black nightgown, but her legs, pale and speckled with liver spots, peeked out from under the bottom of her skirt. She fantasized about what it would be like to have the body of a younger woman. What it would be like to look pretty. A faint noise broke her from her daydream. The sound had risen from just beyond her apartment's door, then faded almost as quickly as it arrived. She looked at the clock. It was 11, past curfew. But perhaps one of her neighbors had just returned from taking part in tonight's festivities. Still, what she had heard hadn't been the jingle of keys or the echo of footsteps. It had been something else. A voice, maybe. One she didn't recognize. She craned her neck, wondering if she had imagined it. But a few moments later, she heard the sound again. A soft whimpering. And this time she was sure it was coming from the hallway. She trapezed slowly across the living room, past her tiny kitchen, keeping her ear to the air as if losing the sound would suddenly cause the mystery to vanish. When she got to the flimsy composite wood door that separated her unit from the hall, she leaned against it and listened, careful not to make a noise so as not to alert whoever was on the other side. It was undeniable now. Someone was crying in the hallway. A woman or a young child, from the sound of it. She told herself not to check, that doing so would be inviting trouble into her life, but her fingers moved as if they had a mind of their own. A slave to her hands, she watched with dread as they turned the lock, twisted the knob, and pulled. The next thing she knew, her door was open, exposing her to whatever was waiting on the other side. Cautiously, she leaned her head into the hall and scanned her surroundings. 2 doors down was a boy and girl huddled together against the wall. They looked like siblings. The boy, dark-skinned and skinny, couldn't have been older than 10, and the little girl he was clutching to his chest was barely old enough to start kindergarten. There were tears in their eyes. She buried her face into her brother's shoulder and let off a soft sob. So the mystery had been solved. But their appearance only raised further questions. Their skin and hair were smeared with dirt, and their pajamas were tattered and filthy. They were shoeless, their feet caked in grime, and she could see the boy's heels had been cut and were bleeding. It seemed they had been walking barefoot through the city streets for a while. It was unsafe to be outside of your home past curfew. There was no telling what might happen if you were spotted by the wrong person, so the children were a peculiar sight. The hallway was empty save for them, but she couldn't help but feel a strange electricity in the air, zipping and buzzing all around as though an invisible semiconductor was about to explode. "Psst," she hissed. The boy snapped his head her way, then recoiled like a frightened animal, but she raised her palms to let him know she meant no harm. "You don't live here," she said. It had come out more of an accusation than a question. The boy shook his head. She glanced quickly over his shoulder just to make sure none of the neighbors had stepped out to investigate, then waved the children over. "Inside, then," she said, pointing to her apartment. "Hurry!" The boy stood and helped his sister to her feet. Perhaps not sensing the urgency, they shuffled slowly past her and into her home. She thought she must have looked like an old witch in that moment, beckoning poor Hansel and Gretel into her house for delight. Only this time, there was no gingerbread or candy to entice them, just dusty rugs and antique furniture, ancient magazines and drapes that smelled like cigarettes. She sat them at the kitchen table so that she could gather her thoughts. Now, up close, the children looked even more ragged than before. It wasn't dirt that they were covered in, it was soot. And this revelation made her even more uneasy. They had been at the fire. The children stared at her, blank expressions on their faces, and she wondered why it was so challenging to get a read on them. "Are you injured?" she asked. They said nothing. "Where are your parents?" But again, she was met with silence. Frustrated, she blurted out, "Where do you live?" Once more, the children stayed quiet, but this question had at least gotten the little boy to stir in his seat. He turned and raised his hand, then extended a finger. She followed it, and realized he was pointing towards the window. Through the glass, the glutton continued to feast, a blazing inferno, burning brighter, more intense than ever. It looked like it would never die. So it was their house, then. They hadn't just been there, they had been the targets. How had they escaped? Desperate to put an end to the madness, she dashed across the living room, then jerked the curtains closed. She had known, at least a part of her had known, that these kids were somehow victims of that awful fire. But this had confirmed it. They were in shock. That was why they weren't talking. But she didn't have time to coddle them. No, she had to coax the kids through this trauma as quickly as possible. They would be in danger if they couldn't snap to their senses soon, and that meant she would be in danger too. She put a kettle on the stove and rummaged through her pantry, looking for something the children might like to eat. She settled on a bag of butterscotch candies. When the kettle began to whistle, she poured the 2 cups of tea and served it to them alongside the sweets. "Careful, it's hot," she warned. But the children did not even attempt to sip it. Instead, they just stared. 2 sets of unblinking eyes, looking back at their teacups, steamed in front of them, and she wondered if there was anything she could do that would break them from their haze. There was a sudden clamor outside of her apartment, the thunder of steel-toed boots storming down the hallway. She scurried back to her door. She cracked it and stuck her head out just enough to see a dozen men wearing paramilitary uniforms and carrying guns were now occupying her building. They had already begun knocking on her neighbors' doors and were working their way down the hall. On each of their arms, they wore a patch that read SFF. She recognized the insignia. Sons of the Founding Fathers. The militia had moved in, armed to the teeth, and at least 100 strong, when the riots had gotten bad. They had been organized, part of a bigger movement that had enacted similar strategies with various degrees of success across the country. With the help of protesters and supporters, they managed to barricade the streets and set up a perimeter around the neighborhood that the cops had been too afraid to breach. It had been easy. People lost faith in the government, and the SFF were promising to restore order once and for all. They would do this, they declared, by rooting out any imitators that were hiding out in the newly declared autonomous zone, masquerading as humans. The peace and order never came, but blood certainly did. And with each person accused and executed, the SFF gained more support in the community. It didn't matter if they had yet to prove that anyone they had killed had in fact been an imitator. All that mattered was that they were doing something, taking action, and the blood they spilled made their supporters feel safe, so long as they weren't caught in their crosshairs. She locked the door again. It was clear who the SFF were looking for. The children were still statuesque, but even the sounds of their pursuers had broken them from their trance. She snatched them by the wrists and whisked them into the bedroom, where she searched wearily for a place to hide them. The room was bare, just a bed and an old armoire. Neither of these would do. They'd be the first places the militia would look if they forced their way into her apartment. Her eyes fell to the connected bathroom. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option she had. There was a knock from the other side. The SFF were already at her apartment. They were being polite for now, but if she lingered too long, they would stop knocking on the door and start trying to break it down. "Wait here," she whispered to the children, then darted to the bathroom. She drew the shower curtain closed, then reappeared in the doorway and coaxed the children towards her. The cabinet beneath the sink was small and cramped, but the kids fit snugly inside. The knocking persisted, louder and more forceful this time. The men at her doorway were losing their patience. "Don't move or make a sound," she said to the kids. She shut the cabinet, shrouding them in darkness. "I'll tell you when it's safe to come out, understand?" The children didn't respond. She would have been surprised if they did, but a part of her had hoped for confirmation that they heard her. "Hang on, I'm coming," she shouted as she hurried back to the front of her apartment. She was in control of her fingers this time. She turned the lock slow and deliberately. Time was valuable to her, and every second she could buy was another second she could use to collect her bearings. 2 men in uniform greeted her when she opened the door. The man in the front was short. Right away she noticed the gun on his hip, and the rifle slung over his shoulder. He wore a hat with the SFF insignia on it, the bill of which pulled down low on his forehead. On the front of his fatigues was a patch. The name read Edwards. Behind him was a man who was built like a mountain, tall, barrel-chested, and broad at the shoulders. He stood rigidly, peering over the head of his compatriot, a nasty grimace on his face. He sported a military buzz and had a jaw so sharp it could cut glass. But she could tell just by the look of him that there wasn't much going on behind his eyes. He snarled menacingly at her, but despite his fierce demeanor, she preferred it to the face of the shorter man. Edwards was smiling cordially, but he wore that grin like a cheap Halloween mask. Beneath it, she could tell, lurked something sinister. "Sorry to bother you, miss," said Edwards, "but we're here representing the sons of founding "I know who you are," she snapped. "What I want to know is what you're doing at my door past curfew." Her response had temporarily broken the man from the character he was playing, and for a brief moment his face flashed the viciousness that he'd been hiding. She had challenged him, and he didn't like that, but she also knew he had bigger fish to fry. Slowly, as if he had unconsciously willed it, the courteous grin returned. "About that. Well, miss," his voice had lowered as though he were sharing a secret, "we don't mean to alarm you, but we've tracked a pair of dangerous imitators to this building. We're currently doing a sweep, going door to door asking the residents if they've seen anything suspicious." "Only thing I've seen tonight is the inside of my eyelids," she said. "You woke me up. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to bed." Edwards nodded. "Hey, perhaps there's the man of the house," he asked. "He might be more helpful in this situation." He recognized that was intended as a shot at her, but she paid it no mind. "Sorry," she said. "I live alone. Good night." She closed the door in the men's faces and twisted the lock hard enough for them to hear it. The apartment was quiet. She rushed back to the bathroom and flipped on the light. Then called out to the children, but heard nothing. Something wasn't right about the room. It took her a moment to realize the shower curtain above the bathtub had been opened. On instinct, she rushed over and drew it quickly. She turned back to the sink and reached towards the cabinet. "Are you there, children?" she asked in the sweetest voice she could muster. The loud knock at her front door caused her to stop in her tracks. "Shit," she muttered. Again, she hurried back across the apartment. When she opened the door this time, most of the militia was filing out of the hallway towards the stairwell, presumably to sweep another floor. Edwards and his behemoth, however, were still there, and it was clear they hadn't moved since she had closed the door on them a minute prior. "What is it this time?" she asked. "So sorry to bother you again, miss," said Edwards. He was still wearing that mask, still putting on his faux air of courtesy. What she hated most about it was that she wasn't sure if he wanted her to see through it. She wanted to follow up and ask you again. "Are you sure you live alone?" She said nothing for a long moment, eyes studying them, trying to decide what his game was, until finally she forced a reply. "Why would you ask me that?" Edward's lips curled at the corner. His mask was ready to crumble, and he couldn't wait for it to come off. His eyes trailed over her shoulder towards the kitchen table. "Well, it's just that you got 2 cups of tea on your table, and I find it mighty odd that a woman who lives alone would have poured herself 2 cups of tea, wouldn't you? I was about to ask you about that before you so curtly slammed your door in our faces." She twisted around and gawked at the mugs. Everything had happened so fast that she'd forgotten to get rid of them. When she turned back towards the men, Edward's mask was completely gone. His smile had stretched wider, but it was his true smile now, mischievous and toothy. A devil's grin. His eyes no longer carried the fake concern that they did before. Now they bore down upon her like the glare of a predator. "I know you won't mind if my friend and I come in and look around," he said, a perverse lilt in his voice. "I'm sorry, but I do mind," she replied. She tried to close the door again, but this time it didn't budge. She looked down to see that Edwards had placed his boot between the door and the frame. "I don't think you understand," he said. There it was. The transformation in his voice was now complete. The real Edwards had shown himself completely, a vindictive, vile little man who would not take no for an answer. "I'm not asking." The larger man grunted, and she backed away from the door. A second later, both were inside her apartment. "Check the kitchen first, Smith," ordered Edwards. Pots and pans clattered to the ground as the tall, brawny man, who she now knew was named Smith, began to rummage through the pantry. He tossed plates to the tile floor, shattering them with little remorse, and knocking anything off the counter that was in his way. By the time he was done, the ground was littered with food. shards of ceramic, and broken glassware. He moved to the living room next and flipped over the couch. "This is ridiculous," she protested. "You're ruining my home! You aren't the police!" Edwards grabbed her by the arm and scowled. It was clear that he was out for blood, and one way or another, children or no children, he was going to have it. "This is a national emergency. The police can't be trusted." And when he said that, he squeezed her arm so tight, she knew he was trying to leave his fingerprints on her skin. "The imitators have infiltrated the police department. They've infiltrated the government. You're a bunch of scared idiots, parroting absurd campfire stories," she said. "Grown men who'd rather play G.I. Joe and blame your shitty lives on some made-up boogeyman than admit that you're the problem." Edward's sneer twisted at her retort. Seemed as if he was about to say something, but Smith had already finished searching the living room and was waiting for further instructions. He leaned in close, and she could smell a hint of booze on his breath. "Last chance. Where are they?" he demanded. "If you don't tell us, you'll be tried as an accomplice." She bade him no reply. He yanked her towards the bedroom, and the larger man followed. The three of them stood in the doorway for a second as Edwards tried to decide on where to search next. He motioned to the bed, so the subordinate got down on his hands and knees, shining his flashlight. "You can look all you want, but you're not going to find any imitators here," said the old woman. "Not under the bed, not in the armoire, not in the—" "Enough!" Edward shouted. He threw the old woman to the floor and stood over her, then unfastened the holster of his gun. "So sick of your voice!" It was then the bathroom door caught his eye. He flashed the woman an arrogant smirk, then nodded his head towards the door. "Smith, in there." The massive man lumbered up from the ground and stomped through the doorway, making a beeline straight for the cabinet. Her eyes widened, wondering what the men would do if they found the kids. Smith reached a clumsy hand towards the cabinet door beneath the sink, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. With a quick jerk, he flung the doors open. It wasn't until he stepped aside that she could see that the cabinet was empty. "Is there anywhere else they could be hiding?" asked Edwards. His lapdog turned to his 9 o'clock, and she knew he was looking at the shower. It was the next logical spot that he could search. He wouldn't find them there, not the children. That she was positive of. "So what do you think they are?" asked the woman. She was still on the bedroom floor, but Edward was surprised to see that she was smiling up at him. "What?" "The imitators. Some think they're demons. Some say space aliens. I once read an article that said that they were a subterranean species that's lived under the earth for thousands of years. I'm just curious, which ridiculous theory do you buy into?" Edwards grimaced. "Doesn't matter. What matters is they're waging a secret war. Our country is under attack." "The country's under attack, all right. But from people like you." "You don't care that you haven't seen one, do you? You don't even care if they're real as long as you can swing your big gun around because it makes you feel like a man." Edwards placed his hand on the butt of his gun. "Just so you know, it's SFF policy to terminate citizens aiding and abetting imitators. But even if it wasn't, I don't think I'd be able to resist putting a bullet between your eyes." It was hard to say if he was playing with her, but he sounded serious enough. She never found out if Edwards was bluffing or not, because before he had a chance to make good on his threat, a scream ripped through the apartment. It was a sharp, ear-splitting shriek, and it caused the little man's head to snap towards the bathroom just in time to see Smith stumble backwards past the doorway, trip over the toilet, and crash into the wall. Whatever he had seen in the shower had shaken him. He pulled his knees into his chest and began rocking back and forth, murmuring incoherently to himself. "The hell's gotten into you?" shouted Edwards. He reached down and snagged the woman by the arm, jerking her to her feet, then dragging her to the bathroom. "By the authority of the sons of the founding fathers," he droned, "I hereby placing you under arrest. You have the right to remain—" He stopped short once he saw the shower, drew in a sharp breath, and whispered, "Holy shit." The corpse sat propped up in the tub. At a glance, it looked like an anatomy dummy, but the dry blood caked across the bottom of the basin and the brown handprints smeared along the walls had dispelled the notion quickly. The corpse's skin had been removed by what appeared to be the delicate hands of a surgeon, shucked right off in fell swoops. The rest of the body, however, was perfectly intact. It was a female cadaver, as evident from the glandular and fibrous tissue sagging from the chest where the breast would be. But aside from that, it was near impossible to make out any other distinguishing details. Edwards began to tremble as he took in the sight, unsure how to process it. In fact, he had become so possessed by the abomination in the bathtub, he hadn't noticed the old woman's arm beginning to writhe in his grip. Her arm was moving not as if she was wriggling it free, but as if something was wriggling inside. "You were looking for imitators?" The words came from behind him. It sounded like the old woman had been joined by an infernal choir, 1,000 gravelly voices all speaking together in unison. "Well, you found one." The larger man scrambled to his feet and broke for the door, but hadn't made it 2 steps before a black appendage shot from the old woman's back and wrapped itself around his waist. He pulled against the doorframe, struggling to free himself as the tentacle slithered up his body like a snake. Smith opened his mouth to scream, but only a pained wince managed to squeak out. The tentacle coiled around his body like a boa constrictor and began to squeeze. Edwards cringed at the sound of his subordinate's ribs snapping and splintering beneath the force of its grip. Blood began to leak from Smith's mouth, followed by what appeared to be organs, as his eyes bulged and his face turned a pale shade of blue. A few seconds later, it dropped him, and he hit the floor with a thud. Vertebrae crushed, heart collapsed inside what was left of his chest. Edwards gaped at Smith's mangled body, which just a few minutes earlier he thought was near invulnerable. Realization set in, and his eyes trailed up from the corpse to the old woman. Things were now squirming beneath her skin, and her flesh reminded him of a bag of night crawlers. He let out a frightened squeal, releasing her arm and then reaching for the gun on his hip. But a second appendage shot from her chest, tearing a hole through her nightgown and snagging his wrist. It was here that he realized it wasn't a tentacle at all, not like one would see on a squid. The appendage was comprised of what appeared to be leeches or slugs, thousands of them, black and shiny, all moving together in unison like a school of fish. They felt cold and slick against his skin. He tried to pull free, but every time he moved his arms, the leeches spun around his wrists, tightening their grip. You're one of them," Edward shuddered. "An imaging—" Before he could finish, another appendage had split off from the one holding onto him and ensnared his throat. He began to choke. He tipped him backwards so that his head was hanging over the edge of the bathtub. "Don't worry. I'm not going to strangle you," said the woman. She no longer looked like a woman at all. All of her features were present, but they moved fluidly around her face as she spoke, wriggling and gesticulating, eyes drooping and rising up her cheeks, lips wandering across her forehead. She had become a slithering sack of flesh. One of the slugs had broken off from the tendrils around Edward's throat and was squirming its way up his face, leaving a trail of slime across his chin and lips. It stopped and perched on the bridge of his nose, and then raised itself up so he could get a good look at its underside. The thing's puckered mouth began to expand, and from it extended a white, needle-like projection. "I'm going to take your skin, and I want you to feel every second of it." The creatures on Edward's face screeched and buried its spike between his eyes. He felt a terrible sting, and then a hot searing pain as it dragged itself inch by inch down the center of his body, splitting his flesh in two. It took only a few minutes to remove his skin. He wasn't even dead by the time she discarded his raw, fleshy, stripped body into the bathtub. In fact, Edwards would lie there for some time, quivering in a ball at the bottom of the tub, staring at his own flesh piled on the floor, before death finally took him. She took pleasure in his final exhale. His skin would do just fine. He wasn't a young woman, like she wanted, but imitating a ranking member of the militia would make it easier to slip out of the autonomous zone. A soft whimper from the bedroom had caught her attention. She twisted her head around like an owl, and her eyes fell on the armoire, where she could see a pair of shadows shifting through the cracks in the door. The children had seen too much. Her body writhed as she slinked towards the cabinet, tendrils trailing behind her and dancing through the air like enchanted serpents. "Children, you can come out," she said, reaching for the door, no longer bothering to mask her voice. It's safe now. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. If you scroll down to the description at the very bottom, you'll find a whole bunch of people there. Also, we've included this nice little scrolling thing because the number of people who support me on Patreon has gotten so big that I'm afraid it might actually max out the description. So we've included this here as the little scrolling text on the end screens. So everybody on that scrolling text, everybody I'm about to mention right now and mispronounce all of your names, and everybody who can donate even $1, thank you so much. A very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Reaper61167, Bobby Karman, Tristain, Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Vicky McQuicky, SamaHigh, CrusaderChocobo, SpookyShel, Atomaurus, Grand Moth the Milky, Big Smoke 369, Captain Scurvy, SaltyIrishPoet, Estebean, Brayden Morris, Nate Kuhl, HorrorFan1212, Hour Minute Second Time, Kyle Reznak, David Martin, Scare-ington the Unkempt, Robert Malcolm, Angela, Spanky, Snoochie Boochie, Seclude, Lupita Galvin, That Creepy Chick, Tyler Fletcher, Merxenum, Red Shadowcat, Xavier the Cheyenne, Demix, Sean Cadieu-baker, 6 Gay Rats in a Trenchcoat, Turtleman, Rob Like Sharp Things, Cryolinian, Xavier Graphius, Lord Life's Best, Goring Tremagacy, Maria Walker, Emily Mitchell, Crazy Kid, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Eka Limchok, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Coffee Zombie, Hidden Tiger, Shelly J, Jeremy H, Psychomel, Nana, Deleted Account, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Darth Miver, Michael Ortiz, Satanic Aries, Bardo Hawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Sashi Suzaku, Cronut 509, Kaylee Ambrose, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Benjamin Welverick, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Raphael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. As always, thank you guys so much, because you guys help me do everything that I do here. You guys help pay authors for stories and commission stories and do everything that I can do to make this channel and make this podcast the best it could possibly be. So thank you all for supporting me here. And as always, everyone, sweet dreams.